also isn't a composer. So like he's playing things that I've already said this, but I feel like in light of like now what we've been talking about with how music is a parallel to life, I guess it's that there's been something that has been discovered or created before him, and his job is to recite that almost. Hold on, there's something else in my head. And it is totally gone. Cool. Yep.
The effects of time, right? As you're thinking, things are sort of gradually appearing and disappearing from your mind. It'll come back to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're interested in this relationship between music and time, there's a really wonderful essay by Henri Bergson, who was a French, he was a French philosopher and a psychologist, Bergson, Bergson. And he wrote an essay which I think is entitled On the Perception of Time. And in it, he explains to us the paradox of time, right? Time seems to be constant change. It seems to consist of an infinite number of moments that are disconnected from each other. However, he compares time to a melody, right? He compares it to a melody where the notes are connected to each other, right? In a way that can only unfold in the course of time. So that is partly where this idea of a musical composition as a metaphor for life comes from. I wish we had a chance to read that essay together, but I hope that you see some of the parallels between a musical performance and, well, life itself. So this is an important point. Are there any questions or comments about that? Yeah.
I had something to add, just thinking about why he is a cellist who's performing other people's work and not composing.
Wonderful.
I think that relates to how Death is following orders, like her whole life she would just follow these orders to like execute death.
Right.
And in the same way he's just following these orders that he plays the music he's told to play.
So let's think about that a little bit more. I think that you might be on the right track, but there is the passage where the orchestra itself, right, and the performance of the orchestra is described, which is on page 189. So maybe someone could read it to us from the top, starting with, "That is her man." So Death goes to the performance, right, one of the cellist's performances, and she listens to him, right, while playing as part of an orchestra. So can somebody read it to us, starting from that sentence?
That is her man, a musician, nothing more. Like the almost 100 other men and women seated in a semicircle around their personal shaman, the conductor, and all of whom will, one day, in some future week or month or year, receive a violet-colored letter and leave their place empty, until some other violinist, flautist, or trumpeter comes to sit in the same chair, perhaps with another shaman waving a baton to conjure forth sounds. Life is an orchestra which is always playing, in tune or out, a Titanic that is always sinking and always rising to the surface. And it is then that it occurs to Death that she would be left with nothing to do if the sunken ship never managed to rise again, singing the evocative song sung by the waters as they cascade from her decks, like the watery song, dripping like a murmuring sigh over her undulating body, sung by the goddess Amphitrite. Okay. Amphitrite at her birth, when she became she who circles the seas. For that is the meaning of the name she is given.
Great. Let's stop there for the time being. So, how does Death describe the orchestra, and how does the orchestra become a metaphor, well, for life? Why does she compare it to a Titanic that is always sinking?
I'm thinking about like the cyclical nature of things, and how, and I'm like visualizing, you're on a stage and someone just falls away due to death, and then someone just pops back up. Basically, that's like the image that comes to my mind. And so, thinking about how, cyclical, like the thing that exists, the stage, we'll say, is always of the orchestra is always gonna exist, and what changes are just the players kind of
Yeah.
that come in and out.
So it seems to suggest what you said earlier, that the cellist and the rest of the musicians are, well, replaceable, right? That they are dispensable. That ultimately, because they're mortal, their place on the stage, once again, is temporary, it is finite. And that the cellist, as well as the rest of the musicians, the entire orchestra, will one day be replaced by a new set of human beings who will continue to perform the same works that the people who came before them were performing on the same stage. That seems to, at least at first glance, introduce a sense of, well, not only cyclicality, but also repetition and maybe even futility, right? The notion that everyone on stage, every member of the orchestra is dispensable. Is there another way of looking at it that perhaps is, well, more hopeful and more optimistic?
I think, I guess relating specifically to talking about them as being the Titanic sinking, I'm thinking of like the band that was on the Titanic.
course, yeah.
And kind of like that whole idea that like the band plays on and it kind of like, I don't know, it gives comfort and meaning in like such a terrible situation,
Mm-hmm.
but that it's like a situation that keeps on happening, which is like,
Mm-hmm.
I guess kind of the futility of life, but that it like keeps on going.
Yeah.
But that there will always be these like groups of people trying to like shed some more light on that. I don't know.
Good.
Help with that.
Good. I like it. I think you're on the right track. What were you gonna say?
I don't know if this is way off, but I saw it kind of as she was realizing that humans are like her purpose and her existence in life through looking at the orchestra.
Wonderful. So that's a big part of it. In other words, Death realizes that the only reason why, well, she has a job, right? The only reason why she has an occupation is because of life, right? In other words, Death's job is to, of course, end lives, right? Yet without life, death itself would cease to exist. So once again, deeply ironic. In other words, we've talked about the way in which life needs death. Now we're talking about the way in which death needs life. In other words, death becomes meaningless without life. Without life, there can be no death. So once again, the relationship between life and death is depicted as mutual, right? It's not merely an antagonistic relationship where death is the opposite of life. It seems that in order for us to find meaning in life, we have to be mortal, and that without mortality, without human mortality, death itself, well, becomes meaningless. Having said that, the image of the Titanic, I think, is really powerful. In other words, it seems to me that the orchestra itself becomes a metaphor, well, for, I guess, civilization. Civilization as a ship that is constantly in the process of sinking. In other words, one of the things that we can say about human civilization is that, of course, every generation is mortal and is doomed to die. In other words, this sort of sense of doom and futility is partly, at least, it stems at least partly from the idea that we're all in the process of dying from the moment that we're born. And that might give our goals, our actions, right, our dreams, it might give them a sense of, well, futility and maybe even absurdity. However, right, the musicians on stage, the musicians that Death is observing, are in the process of recreating works of art that seem to have endured, that seem to have transcended the change that comes with time. In other words, these mortal human beings seem to partake of infinity and eternity by recreating these, works of art. In other words, it is by creating works of art that these musicians, who themselves are mortal, whose lives are finite, whose existence is fragile and always on the brink of extinction, it is one of the beautiful things about life that we as mortal human beings can not only partake, but perhaps maybe even create something that is eternal, that is immortal. So what do you think about that? No? I thought you would appreciate it.
I appreciate it. It's intense. And
Yeah.
it's really good.
So this idea that we're mortal, right, in and of itself might appear to reduce all of our endeavors, well, to dust. It might sort of make us conclude that whatever it is that we do, whether or not we create works of art or whether, we sell, sneakers, right, that these endeavors are devoid of meaning and purpose precisely because we're going to die. Saramago seems to show us how we as mortal, finite human beings who are always living, right, on the brink of death, how we're capable of creating something that is eternal and that is immortal, something that transcends human mortality. And this idea that ultimately, in spite of our mortality, or maybe because of it, right, we're capable of creating works of art that will outlive us, that perhaps will live forever. So once again, there's this juxtaposition between time and eternity, and also this juxtaposition between mortality and immortality. The idea that immortality is something that can be brought into the world by beings that in and of themselves are mortal and finite, I think is extremely beautiful. And it seems to me that death begins to appreciate the fact, right, that human beings are capable of creating something that lasts forever in spite of their mortality, or maybe even because of it. So what does it mean to think of, human civilization as an orchestra, right? I mean, that's an interesting image in and of itself. What does that imply? Yeah, what do you think?
That we each have a role,
Yes?
that we're each contributing to a whole.
Yeah, so it seems to suggest that our individual existence ultimately is part of a larger whole. We talked about the fact that the cellist is alone, that he seems to live a life of solitude and maybe even isolation and alienation. However, when we see him as part of an orchestra, we begin to see the connections between himself and others. In other words, rather than recreating these immortal works of art entirely by himself, he does it literally in concert with other human beings. In other words, it is our collective desire to create something that is immortal, something that is lasting, that seems to redeem not only the individual, but maybe human civilization as a whole. In other words, human civilization as a whole might be condemned as being, corrupt, immoral, vicious, all of the things that we saw in the previous part of the novel. But this image seems to redeem human civilization and suggest that the connections that exist between us, that it is those connections that allow us to be able to create meaning not only in our individual existence, but perhaps to contribute to the overarching sense of meaning in the world in general. So once again, meaning with a capital M versus meaning with, a lowercase m, right? There's the idea of individual meaning that we discussed with Yvonne, right? But there's also this sort of pursuit of meaning that is collective, which is something that we pursue as a civilization, right? It's called culture. Culture is basically human endeavor of, discovering meaning in the universe, discovering it and maybe even, creating it if it's not to be found in the world as it is. And that, of course, is one of the things that we can say about the cellist. He is part of that endeavor. And that already seems to suggest that his life is not as isolated, is not as lonely and alienated as it might have appeared to be at first glance. Said a lot. Questions, comments?
I guess, I don't know, I think about this a lot as someone studying art, but why, I don't know, I guess what are your motives for creating things? And I think part of it is certainly to have some foothold in something that's going to outlast you as a mortal being, but then also I don't know how that relates to other people in the world, or how you're doing that to like contribute something to like future generations or like people around you. And I think that maybe like goes back to again to like Schopenhauer and like how he talks about artists as like, I don't know, people on the vanguards, like showing people how to find meaning in their own existence. But yeah, it's like
Yeah. No, I agree with you, and in a lot of ways I think this is where Saramago and Schopenhauer obviously part ways. Right? One of the things that Saramago wants for us to do is to not only imagine the dystopian vision of immortality, but ultimately to perhaps re-envision death itself, which means to sort of re-envision life and what makes life meaningful. In other words, this idea that that death is, well, at the center of this novel, I don't think ultimately is aligned with Schopenhauer's nihilism, right? Saramago, I think, is far from being nihilistic. I think that, in fact, by forcing us to confront death, right, as a person, as a character, what he wants for us to do is not to succumb to nihilism and to come to the conclusion that life is not worth living the way that Schopenhauer did. Instead, I think he wants to show us that there is not only an inextricable relationship between life and death, but that life is inherently meaningful. And it is meaningful in spite of its fragility, in spite of its fleeting nature, and ultimately, death is not an obstacle on the path to meaning and purpose. So let's read another paragraph, which is still on page 189, and it starts immediately after the sentence that we just read. Can somebody read it to us, starting with, Death wonders whether the Amphitrite is now the daughter of Nereus and Doris. So who's going to read that for us?
Death wonders where Amphitrite is now, the daughter of Nereus and Doris. Where is she now, she who may never have existed in reality, but who nevertheless briefly inhabited the human mind in order to create in it, again only briefly, a certain way of giving meaning to the world, of finding ways of understanding reality. But they didn't understand it, thought Death, nor will they, however hard they try, because everything in their lives is provisional, precarious, transitory, gods, men, the past, all gone, what it will not always be, and even I, Death, will come to an end when there's no one left to kill, either in the traditional manner or by correspondence. We know that this is not the first time such a thought has passed through whatever part of her it is that thinks, but it was the first time that thinking it had brought her such a feeling of profound relief, like that of someone who, having completed a task, slowly leans back to take a rest. Suddenly, the orchestra fell silent. All that can be heard is the sound of a cello. It's what they'd call a solo, a modest solo that will last, at most, 2 minutes. It's as if from the forces invoked by the shaman a voice had arisen, speaking perhaps in the name of all those who are now silent. Even the conductor doesn't move. He's looking at the same musician who left open on a chair the sheet music of Suite No. 6, Opus 1012, in D major by Johann Sebastian Bach, a suite he will never play in this theater, because he is merely a cellist in the orchestra, albeit the leader of his section, not one of those famous concert artistes who travel the world playing and giving interviews, receiving flowers, applause, plaudits, and medals. He's lucky that he occasionally gets a few bars to play solo, thanks to some generous composer who happened to remember the side of the orchestra where little, if anything, out of the ordinary tends to happen.
Actually, let's stop there. Thank you. I didn't mean for you to read that far, but again, everything here seems to be relevant. So, yes, once you get going, you kind of have to keep going. So one of the first things that we need to talk about is, of course, the beginning of this paragraph, where Death describes human existence as provisional, precarious, transitory, right? Where nothing lasts. One of the things that I want for you to sort of think about is how the cellist's performance, how his solo, seems to contradict her assumption. In other words, Death at this stage in the story seems to believe that human beings can know nothing about the meaning of life, precisely because we're mortal. That it is precisely because our existence is provisional, precarious, and transitory that we can know nothing of the meaning of life. And then there's the solo. It is a solo of a particular piece. Has anybody bothered to look it up? So maybe I'll pull it up during the break so we can listen to it, because I think it's important. It is a specific piece of music, it's very short. And Saramago chose it for a reason, and I want for you to listen to it to try to understand, well, the meaning of the solo itself and what it reveals to us about the cellist. So, yes.
Oh, is this the same piece of music that he talks about? Like, you can know everything to know about a person, and okay, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So first of all, why is it at this point in the story that the cellist gets to perform a solo, right? We've talked about an orchestra, we've talked about the way in which his performance is merely part of the larger fabric of art and culture to which he contributes, right? But in which he does not star. So why does he have this unusual moment of being the center of attention? Yeah.
To kind of illustrate the fact that individuality still exists within the whole.
Wonderful. So why is that important? Say more.
Because it makes not only like life as a whole important, but every individual person's life has some greater importance to creating the greater picture, which I think really does tie into like the divergence away from nihilism and going into like more of like, I don't know what the opposite meaning of nihilism is,
Yeah.
but that and like how individual importance contributes to the whole, but like it's still like its own separate thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that what Saramago wants to show us is that an individual isn't simply absorbed, right, by the civilization, by the culture as a whole. That individual meaning is something that is so important in this novel. And I think the solo becomes the perfect example of that. In other words, very few of us get to occupy center stage, right? We all get, I don't know, how much is it, 5 seconds of fame? Is that the same? 15. Well, that's a lot more than I was counting on. But, right, very few of us get to, well, be center stage, right? Most of us live lives that are ordinary, that are average, that are, you know, not that different from the life led by Yvonne, for instance. Having said that, right, in spite of the fact that perhaps most of us will never enjoy the kind of fame and stardom that, I don't know, a soloist of an orchestra would enjoy every night, that does not mean that our lives are devoid of meaning and purpose, that our lives ultimately are uninteresting, that they're boring, and that they're not worth living. So the opposite of nihilism, of course, is optimism, right, and hopefulness. And in that sense, the solo that the cellist performs is extremely important. He does not usually perform solos, yet this is the moment where he has a chance to express, well, something about himself, something deeply personal, something deeply meaningful, something that is essential to him as an individual. Good, excellent. So the piece is by Bach, and I will try to find it on YouTube during the break. But in the meantime, why don't we find the passage where we will read about the cellist's musical portrait and compare it to, well, his physical portrait. I think that passage is at page 192, if I'm not mistaken. Can someone read it to us from a sentence that starts at the bottom? One day in conversation with some colleagues. So who wants to read that for us?
One day in conversation with some colleagues in the orchestra who were talking jokingly about the possibility of composing musical portraits, genuine ones, not just pictures of types like
Mussorgsky.
Mussorgsky portraits of Samuel Goldenberg and Schumann.
Mm-hmm.
He said that, assumingly such a thing really were possible in music, they would find his portrait not in any cello composition, but in the briefest of Chopin
Etudes.
Chopin Etudes, Opus 25, number 9 in G flat major. When asked why, he replied that he simply couldn't see himself in any other piece of music, and that this seemed to him the best of reasons. And that in the space of 58 seconds, Chopin had said all there was to say about someone he could never possibly have met. For a few days, by way of an amiable joke, the Whittier Orchestra members called called him 58 Seconds, but the nickname was far too long to stay, and besides, it's impossible to keep up a dialogue with someone who has decided to take 58 seconds to reply to a question put to him.
So I was wrong. These two compositions are different. In the previous one that he plays the solo that he plays is by Bach, but the musical portrait is by Chopin. So maybe we should listen to both actually and see whether or not the comparison reveals something to us about the cellist that is, well, interesting and useful. Having said that, the piece by Chopin is only 58 seconds. Why do you think that the cellist believes that it is this extremely short piece of music, which consists of 58 seconds? It is not even a full minute, right? That it seems to, well, encapsulate his entire personality, his entire existence. Can you imagine any work of art that is shorter than a minute, revealing to us exactly who you are?
It's difficult to try to do. I don't know. I mean, the piece is really beautiful. I can see how it would, but
I mean, why not pick a symphony? You know, that sounds, you know, most of us, I think, in our own self-estimation would think that our lives deserve maybe a symphony, or at least, I don't know, a fully sort of realized piece of music, maybe a song, right? If not an entire symphony. In this case, it is a 58-second extract that is supposed to capture the essence of who the cellist is. Is he being unnecessarily modest?
I don't know. I guess it kind of, again, goes back to the, like, life is very short, but also can be, like, very beautiful. Like, specifically for him, and I think it's also, like, ironic because he's supposed to be dead.
True.
I kind of just like but yeah, I don't know. I think it's interesting that it's the Chopin interlude because it is like it's not a symphonic piece. It's like
Yes.
one person playing like this really like sweet short
Yeah.
piano piece.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that can like encapsulate an individual really well.
So I guess what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that 58 seconds could be equivalent of 58 years. Am I right?
Yeah, I guess you could go that far. Yeah.
I mean, that's what I take from
Yeah.
your comment. In other words, the brevity of this interlude, which is 58 seconds, is supposed to, I think, symbolize the brevity of human existence.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, human existence, although it might be 58 years, right, from the standpoint of history, from the standpoint of eternity, is, well, equivalent to 58 seconds of music. In other words, the 58 seconds of music, I think, are supposed to encapsulate the brevity, the finitude of human existence, and the idea that in the grand scheme of things, right, a human existence is, well, extremely fragile, extremely finite. Yet it seems that within those 58 seconds, one might be able to find an infinity of meaning, right? An entire person's existence could be captured in those 58 seconds, just as an entire human existence can be revealed in only 58 years of life. So I guess what we need to do is now to listen to those pieces of music. So why don't I find them while you take a short break, and then we'll listen to them and see what we make of it, okay? All right, so 5 minutes and 58 seconds. suntan?
Yeah, it's great.
Okay. Any questions about anything that we've said so far before we listen to some music? Okay. So let's listen to the Chopin first, and then listen to the solo after that. So I think this is it. Okay, somebody else is coming. Oh, sorry about that. Is this what you expected? 58 seconds.
No.
Why not?
I didn't expect it to be so light and uplifting.
Yes. Wonderful. What else?
Kind of like frenzy, chaotic, fast.
Yeah, I mean the tempo is really fast. What else do you notice about this piece?
So very piano heavy.
Well, Chopin usually composed for the piano, so yes, that's true. There's only one instrument, and it is the piano. What else? Does anything else come to mind?
Oh, I was just wondering, isn't the title have something to do with butterfly or something? Okay, so yeah, I guess that's kind of,
Yeah, it's usually referred to as the butterfly piece.
okay, yeah.
So why do you think that might be the case?
I guess, I mean, it's really like flitting and like happy and quick, but also like the life cycle of a butterfly is really
Yeah.
short, but then it goes back to kind of like the whole cyclical nature that we've been talking about like throughout this entire book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in other words, it is short, right? It obviously is extremely, well, the tempo is extremely fast, but it also is, well, you know, the mood of the piece is extremely uplifting. It seems to be, it wouldn't be the piece that Saramago that Schopenhauer would choose, right, in order to depict, well, a human being's life. In other words, it seems to contradict, in a lot of ways, Schopenhauer's nihilistic depiction of human existence. And the idea that, you know, the title refers to a butterfly already suggests both beauty as well as the ephemeral nature, right, of that beauty. The idea that this existence, as beautiful and as optimistic as it is of course extremely finite. So what does it tell us about the cellist? Why do you think he might have chosen that particular piece to describe himself as his musical portrait?
Seems like a happy person.
Exactly. Yeah. In other words, it seems to suggest that he is a happy person. What else do you think might have led him to choose this particular piece as his musical portrait? Well, you might have to think about that a little bit more in your papers, because obviously that is one of the questions. I would be curious to see what you pick as your musical portrait. I mean, it almost feels like an assignment that's just waiting to be, I don't know, made. I don't know. Would you be interested in sharing your musical portrait with the rest of us? You would? All right. Well, maybe next week. Yeah. Or maybe How about this? Maybe on our last day of class, we will all participate in that, including myself. I have to think about it. Yeah, I really have to think about it. 58 seconds. That's the rule. 58 seconds. You can't play us a symphony. Yeah.
It almost feels like just as it's getting started, it's over.
Yeah.
Like that's like just as we're getting used to, we're like, oh, this is what it is, and
Yeah.
then it's just done.
Yeah, the piece carries us forward. The tempo is really fast, but of course, right, the beginning and the end are extremely close together. So once again, the finitude of this piece, right, combined with its optimism, seems to be ironic, right? The idea that this sort of this finite existence can seem to contain with it so much beauty, so much happiness, and so much pleasure and enjoyment. Does not merely contradict Schopenhauer, it also depicts life in a very particular light. So let's listen to the cello performance. I don't know how long it is, and I hope we'll be able to listen to the whole thing. And there's an ad that unfortunately we have to sub.
With the money I saved, I gotta get a spa day.
Now, for a limited time only, LASIK Plus can help fix your vision starting at $250 per eye. Our best
LASIK Plus. Unfortunately, we can't listen to the whole thing. It's quite a bit longer than 58 seconds, but does this give you a taste? How is this piece of music different from the previous one, and why do you think that Saramago chooses these two to help us understand the cellist? How is this excerpt different from the Chopin?
It focuses like more on the minor keys, so it's a little bit more of a negative connotation.
Yeah.
One thing that I kind of picked up was it has like, I don't know if I'm like really going out on it, but it has kind of like a back and forth, like almost pendulum type sound. And maybe it's also because I used to play the cello, but it's like the movement.
You did.
Yeah.
Perfect.
The like movement back and forth is very
Yeah.
like it's the swinging of that.
That's interesting. I wouldn't have known that. I'm not a musicologist. I play no instrument to my embarrassment. And unfortunately, I don't think I will ever learn. So that's interesting. So yeah, the mood of this piece obviously is a lot more poignant, right? I think that, you know, it's less, well, cheerful and peppy than the previous one. Why do you think that might be the case? What is this piece supposed to represent? In other words, this is the cellist solo, and he plays it at a particular point in the novel.
Well, I'm thinking about what you show to others or what you perform for others versus what you claim as your own or play for yourself.
Yeah.
Kind of. So like this is, I'm thinking like the duality of existence of being a human, the the inherent nuances that
Yeah.
come with being a human. So this piece is a lot a bit longer in nature, a bit more somber, I guess, in tone, and this is what he's showing to an audience
Yeah.
versus the piece that he claims as his own, which is more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with everything that you said, and in addition to that, I'd like to point out another paragraph because he plays this solo twice, right? He plays it again at a concert that Death attends when she is determined to, well, hand him the violet letter. So let's turn to page 218, and can someone read it to us, starting in the middle? The orchestra has fallen silent. So who's going to read that for us?
The orchestra has fallen silent. The cellist starts to play his solo as if he had been born for that alone. He doesn't know that the woman in the box has her brand new handbag, a violet-colored letter addressed to him. He doesn't know, how could he? And yet he plays as if he were bidding farewell to the world, as if he were at last saying everything that he had always kept unsaid. The truncated dreams, the frustrated yearnings, in short, life. The other musicians stare at him in amazement, the conductor with surprise and respect. The audience sighs, a shudder runs through them, and the veil of pity that clouded the sharp gaze of the eagle is now a veil of tears. The solo is over, the orchestra washed over the cello's song like a great slow sea, gently submerging it, absorbing and amplifying that song as if to lead it into a place where music was transmuted into silence, into the mere shadow of a vibration that touched the skin like the final inaudible murmur of a kettle drum on which a passing butterfly had momentarily alighted.
Great. So again, the image of a butterfly, right, which I think is significant. But what does this piece express, and why is it that the audience, including Death herself, is transfixed in that moment? What is this performance supposed to convey? What do you think?
Not exactly sure, but I feel like it's more about like this hidden life, kind of what you were saying before, like stuff that was kept like out of like everyday presentation of yourself.
Yeah, I agree with both of you about that. So is there more to it though?
I don't know if I had something to say specifically for that, but the part
Okay.
that really I kind of got to in the second read was talking about when the solo was over and how the orchestra like washes over and submerges it, but also
Yeah.
like it's not like an echo, but it like heightens it. It keeps on going with the melody,
Wonderful.
so it's like
Yeah.
you've made your voice heard, and like that
Excellent.
has like reverberations with other people, even though like your part is over.
Yeah, so in other words, once again, the relationship between the individual, right, and civilization as a whole, between an individual artist and the culture, right, the solo and the performance of the orchestra, and how, well, one seems to cancel out the other, and yet how they work in relationship to each other, how the solo, although it is drowned out by the orchestra, literally speaking, also of course, for at least a moment, transfixes the audience and allows them to be able to focus on this particular piece, while at the same time heightening the performance of the orchestra as a whole, the relationship between society and individual, the relationship between an individual artist and the culture in which that artist creates, right? And they're depicted, of course, as inextricably linked. But the solo itself is a farewell. It is that cellist swan song, right? It is supposed to be his last performance. He doesn't know it yet, but he's going to die. And this is the last performance of his life. This is the performance which is penultimate, right? It is his opportunity to communicate to others what matters to him, right? In other words, this is a farewell that is supposed to somehow express the meaning of existence for the cellist. And it seems to transfix the audience. In other words, the relationship between the artist and the audience in this case seems to be of the kind that Schopenhauer had envisioned. The artist seems to communicate the truth, not only of his own individual existence, but maybe of human existence as a whole in that brief solo performance. My advice to you is to listen to the whole thing at home when you have more time to try to understand what Saramago means by it. But this is supposed to be not only a farewell song, it is ultimately, I think, is supposed to be the expression of some sort of universal meaning and truth, right? That art ultimately tries to express by means of individual, subjective, personal expression. So once again, it is this synthesis between the individual and the universal, between subjective and objective, between life and death, that I think is supposed to be symbolized by this particular piece. So again, I said a lot. I love this part of the novel, by the way. I don't know about you, but this is my favorite part to talk about. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting that prior to this solo, he's been described as so average and so
Yes.
yeah, I mean, average is pretty much the way to put it. And that even though he's unaware of the fact that he's gonna die, Saramago's choice is to have this solo be a farewell song. I think that it's just, I'm not quite sure I fully understand why the solo wasn't average. Because the next night it's average though, right? Like he plays it again and it's not.
Yeah,
right?
no, it's not as good. Well, here is a sentence that I think might answer your question.
Okay.
So on page 218, Saramago says, the cellist starts to play solo as if he had been born for that alone.
Right, but
That doesn't answer it?
well, no, I
Okay.
mean, it kind of does. I guess I'm just interested in
Yeah.
like, why that night did he play like he had been born for that alone, but any other night maybe it was just his vocation.
So he plays it in the presence of death, right? I think that's the answer. The next time that he plays it, death does not show up.
Right.
He's waiting for her, he's looking for her, she does not appear. His performance is heightened. In fact, it seems to be the performance of his life. In that performance, he seems to have achieved the ultimate purpose of his existence. He was born to perform this particular piece on this particular night. That one single performance gives his life meaning and purpose, right? The way that Ivan's moment of empathy gives his life meaning moments before death. In other words, this means that both the cellist and Ivan are now ready to die. They have led meaningful lives. That moment of meaning might have been brief, but it seems to have redeemed the rest of their lives from meaninglessness and, well, absurdity. This is the moment. And Saramago says that each of us maybe gets to have that moment, whether we realize it or not. Does that help? Good. Excellent. So let's turn back to death. She has been attending the cellist's performance. She has been sneaking into his apartment at night and watching him sleep. In fact, she had to, well, choose a body, right, in which she's going to appear to him. And she also even has to choose, well, her outfit, which sounds a bit ironic and silly, in order to be able to seduce the cellist. So why don't we turn to some of those passages together and read them before we turn to some of the final scenes. So where do I want to go?
It's when she's like talking to the cipher.
Where is that? Everything is underlined. It's a problem. I think it's page 205. I think that's what it is. Page 207, I think, is a better paragraph. So, let's start with since you never leave this room, you have no idea. Middle of page 207. So who's going to read that for us? Please, do you want to read?
Since you never, sorry, Susan.
That's okay.
Since you never leave this room, you have no idea what people are wearing these days. That blouse looks very like others I can remember from when I ended up in active life. Fashions go in cycles, they come and go, they go and come. If I were to tell you what I see out in the streets, no need to tell me, I believe you. Don't you think this blouse goes well with the color of the trousers and the shoes? Yes, agreed the sleuth. And with this cap I'm wearing, yes, that too. And with the fur coat, yes. And with the shoulder bag, yes. You're quite right. And with his earrings, right about, come on. Admit it, I'm irresistible. That depends on the kind of man you have to seduce, but you think I look pretty, and that's what I said to begin with. In that case, goodbye. I'll be back on Sunday, or Monday at the latest. Don't forget to send off the mail each day, and that shouldn't be too hard to a task for someone who spends all his time leaning against the wall. You've got the letter, Essendon. Deciding not to rise to such sarcasm. Yes, it's in here, said Death, tapping her back with the tips of slender, well-manicured fingers, which anyone would be pleased to kiss.
What is going on here? Death needs to pick out an outfit. She wants to look irresistible. She has well manicured fingers, and well, she seems to become not merely a real woman, but a beautiful woman. What do we make of all this? Why does she go to meet the cellist in person, and why does she want to look seductive to the cellist? What is happening to Death in this novel?
I mean, she's like humanized more. When I first read it, I thought it was really cute because she's like pumping herself up, like she wants to be really pretty, and like she's doing this all for a purpose,
Yeah.
ultimately, but also like it's like her beginning to have feelings for the cellist.
So I agree with both of you. In other words, this is, of course, partly the transformation of Death, right? She becomes human. She gradually becomes more and more human. In other words, one of the things that Saramago seems to be able to create here is not merely the personification of Death, but the humanization of Death, which raises, of course, a lot of questions. So this passage in particular made me think about something that I did in my other class. We read Gogol's The Nose, and in that story, right, the nose becomes a character in his own right. And people were wondering what the nose would look like and what, it would be like to actually create an image of the nose, and we did that. And then I had some of those images published on the Random House website. So I was wondering whether you'd be interested in creating illustrations of Saramago's Death. Is that something that you would be interested in doing? You don't have to, obviously. This is not an assignment that you'll be graded on. But if you do, we will look at them together in class, and I will try to get yours published as well. How's that? They were featured on the Random House website. I think that's a nice credit to add to your CV. So I will try to get yours published, but you have to create them. So if you decide to submit them, send them to me, when you get a chance. Deal? Okay. So to return to Death herself, right? She is humanized by Saramago. She's not merely personified, she's humanized. In fact, it is on page 209 that he describes her in a very, I think, paradoxical fashion. So can someone read it to us, starting with the top? We won't give the name to the girl in the dark glasses. So who wants to read that for us?
We wouldn't give that name to the girl in dark glasses who then we would be quite right in saying, that's life, and giving a resigned shrug. Be that as it may, and let this serve as some consolation, the letter that Death is carrying in her bag bears the name of another addressee and another address. Our turn to fall from the scaffolding has not yet come.
Yes. So what is the scaffolding here? The fall from the scaffolding. Does anybody recognize it? It's Yvonne falling off the ladder in Death of Yvonne and Each. That is a direct reference. Did you catch that?
No.
Good. Well, I'm glad that I was able to point it out for you. I guess that's why they named me the big box. I don't know. So one of the things that I think we need to discuss is that death in this passage is described as the very personification of life, right? This is not merely ironic, it is deeply paradoxical. How can death become the personification of life? What does Saramago mean by this?
Death is a part of life. It is a unnegotiable part of life.
Mm-hmm.
You can't have life without death.
So we've talked about the idea that death is perhaps not the antithesis of life, but part of life. But in this case, death is the very personification of life. The two become not only, continuous, they become indistinguishable, right? In fact, somehow, in order to understand life, right, in order to, sort of personify it, Saramago uses death herself. So it is a relationship of identity, not merely of continuity. Why would Saramago make that point?
I guess like in becoming humanized and like she's just like going deeper and deeper into this fascination she has for life. Like so much so that she like tries to like put herself in its image. But it's like she's like just really like obsessed to the extent that she like becomes it.
Yeah, in other words, death becomes seduced by life. What we see here is a seduction of an unusual sort. Death falls in love with life. Not only that, she falls in love with one of her victims. She falls in love with a particular human being that she seems unable to bring herself to kill. So this idea that the relationship between life and death is a relationship of passionate love, where have we seen that before? Of course, so say more about that.
Okay, so for Kierkegaard, faith was an act of love, and faith is the surrendering of self and individuality. So I don't know. For him, it was ultimately life was ultimately an act of love.
Yeah, in other words, one of the things that we talked about since the very beginning is that for Kierkegaard, faith is a form of passionate love, and that in order to be able to become one with God, which is to say to choose faith, we have to surrender our selfhood, surrender our individuality willingly and passionately. In other words, to die, according to Kierkegaard, is to fall in love. Yeah.
And the very thing that makes death is the fact that she kills.
Yes.
And she can't bring herself to kill the cellist.
Yes.
So there's like a surrendering of self or identity in that.
So we'll have to talk about that, right, when we turn to the conclusion. So you're absolutely right to point that out, but what I do want to point out to you is that there's some interesting parallels here between Saramago and Kierkegaard, right? In other words, for Kierkegaard, faith is a form of death, right, whether literal or metaphorical. To cease to be a self is to die. It's to cease to exist as an individual, to become part of a greater whole. And according to Kierkegaard, the only way that we can make that leap is out of passionate love. In other words, passionate love is akin to death. To die and to fall in love, right, ultimately are synonymous with each other. Something similar is happening here. the cellist falls in love with death, which is similar perhaps to the Kierkegaardian notion of passionate love as a form of dying, as a form of ceasing to be a self. However, death falls in love with her victim, and we still need to try to understand the deeper meaning of that. She becomes the very personification of life. She is seduced by life, and she wants, in other words, to feel alive, which of course is deeply paradoxical. So, Death brings the letter to the cellist. She meets him after the concert, and she cannot bring herself to deliver the letter. What do we make of that? What is happening to Death? Why is she unable to fulfill her job? Why can't she simply hand the letter over to the cellist and get it over with? Yeah.
She's starting to see death on a more personal level, and before she was seeing it on like a wider range, kind of like in the first part of the book, and like now in the second part of the book, we're seeing death on an individual level, and so she's starting to see death personally.
I think that's exactly right. In other words, she begins to form a subjective, intimate, individual relationship to her victims. Whereas before, she delivered these letters through the post, which means that she was detached, she was impartial, she wasn't attached to her victims. In the case of the violinist, she forms a relationship with him. It is a relationship that seems to turn into, passionate love. So why don't we turn to page 214 and try to understand why Death hesitates. Can somebody read it to us starting with, do you know why you're talking? Middle of page 214.
Do you know who you're talking to? That part?
Yes, sorry, Claritin is wearing off. I'm starting to use it. You can tell exactly when it stops working because my brain literally just shuts off. Okay, somebody else. You want to read?
Do you know who you're talking to? No, Death is not pleased with her own behavior. She is sure that in her skeletal form, she would never have behaved like that. Perhaps it's because I've taken on human form, she thought. These things are catching. She glanced out of the window and recognized the street they were driving along. This is a Chell Street, and that's the ground floor apartment where he lives. Death seemed to feel a tightening in her solar plexus, a sudden agitation of the nerves, like the shiver that goes through a hunter when he spies his prey. When he has it within his sights, it can be a kind of obscure fear, as if she were beginning to feel afraid of herself.
Great. Death becomes afraid of herself. Why? What is going through her mind? How does she try to explain why it is that she, hesitates to deliver the letter to the cellist?
Well, we're experiencing a transformation.
Yes. Of what sort?
She's becoming human, right? So, or, I don't know, I just feel like I'm thinking about, going back to Kierkegaard and thinking about how one transforms, or thinking about, talking about, Buddhism or something, and thinking about transformation. So, I don't know, I'm thinking of it's almost seems of like a spiritual or a metaphysical, I don't know, there's like a coming to that she's having. There's like this discomfort that she has with herself.
Yeah.
That feels indicative of any kind of transformation.
Well, she has a human body. She has a solar plexus. She feels anxiety, right? In other words, she begins to understand what it is like to be human, right? By acquiring a human form, she begins to understand what it means to be human and what it means to be afraid of death, right? In other words, she understands human relationship to death, and she begins to fear herself. In other words, she begins to understand the nature of human existence and the fear that comes with mortality, as well as the feelings and sensations that we as human beings are capable of experiencing precisely because we have a body, precisely because we have this human form, right, made of flesh. So death itself begins to transform. She seems to take on human qualities. It's not merely that she now understands that she has an individual relationship to every single one of her victims. It's not merely that her relationship to the cellist becomes personal. It is that she herself seems to become human. And that, of course, seems deeply ironic, right? Death is supposed to be the negation of life. Yet in this novel, death seems to be able to experience life firsthand from a human point of view. Is your mind just kind of
Yeah, I mean,
blown?
I'm thinking
You
about
look like
how,
you're
like,
suffering.
No, I mean, it feels good. It's like
Okay, okay.
I feel like no, it's just really interesting. Like I'm thinking about how it almost feels like this is the point in which like her life is beginning to have meaning, but in the wake of that, her existence is becoming no longer necessary.
Yeah.
I guess because for her, as she becomes human, she is when you are embodied by when you are a human, you are then I'm just thinking about the first part of the novel and
Yeah.
all of the horrors of that come with immortality, which is then her entire existence.
Yes.
And so now her existence involves temporality, or it's not enduring, it's not forever, and so I don't know. That's why my mind kind of is like that.
Well,
I felt too good.
it raises questions, right? If death falls in love with life, is she out of a job? Is she fired? To use a famous phrase that I'm loath to repeat. The question then becomes, right, what happens to death when she falls in love with life and when she falls in love with a particular person that she, hesitates to kill? In other words, death paradoxically no longer wants to kill. She seems to reject the very purpose of her existence. And then the question then becomes, what is the purpose of death? If the purpose of death is no longer to kill, does Saramago ascribe a new meaning and purpose to death in this novel? And that is one of the central questions that we're yet to touch on. So why don't we turn to page 217, and this is where we begin to see how the cellist falls in love with death. He notices her at his performance, so let's read that description from the top. Wearing the new dress that she bought yesterday. Who's gonna read that?
So what page is it? Oh,
217. Yeah. Some people haven't really given us much today in terms of participation in reading. Do you want to read?
Wearing the new dress that she bought yesterday in a shop downtown, Death goes to the concert. She is sitting alone in the box, and just as she did during the rehearsal, she was looking at the cellist. Just before the lights went down, when the orchestra was waiting for the conductor to come, he noticed her. He wasn't the only musician to do so. Firstly, because she was alone in the box, which, although not rare, wasn't that frequent an occurrence either. Secondly, because she was pretty, possibly not the prettiest woman in the audience, but pretty in a very particular, undefinable way that couldn't be put into words. Like a line of poetry whose ultimate meaning, if such a thing exists in a line of poetry, continually escapes the translator. And finally, because her lone figure there in the box, surrounded by emptiness and absence on every side, as if she inhabited a void, seemed to be the expression of the most absolute solitude.
Great, let's stop there. So for those of you who want to paint a portrait of death, please use this passage as an inspiration. Having said that, what does this description reveal to us about death? Why is it that she leaves such an impression not only on the cellist but also everyone else in the orchestra?
Well, she kind of comes off detached almost. She's very, very different air than most people. Well, I think humans.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not just her looks, but that, like the way she encapsulates people.
Yeah, so in other words, it's not necessarily her beauty, it's not necessarily her physical appearance that makes her noticeable. It seems that it is her absolute solitude, the idea that she seems to exist in a void, right? What does that reveal to us about death and what happens to death when she falls in love with the cellist?
Well, then she's not existing in the void anymore. She's not alone. She
Wonderful.
has a kinship with someone.
Wonderful. So in other words, once again, love is the force, right? That according to Tolstoy and according to Kierkegaard, allows us to be able to transcend our solitude, to become a part of something greater than ourselves, to make a connection to an other, right? In other words, death in her original state exists in a void, exists in a state of absolute solitude. And this is, of course, one of the changes, one of the fundamental changes that Saramago envisions that happen to death when she falls in love. In other words, when she falls in love with the cellist, she seems to be able to escape her isolation, to escape her solitude, to be able, right, to emerge from that void and connect to a human being. That connection will transform her forever. We talked about the cellist as existing in a kind of a void, a state of almost complete and utter solitude. And once again, as somebody has pointed out earlier, they become mirror images of each other. While it was the cellist who appeared to be utterly alone, now it is death that is depicted as being solitary, in a state of complete solitude. So it is from this point forward that the cellist begins to fall in love with death. He wants to be able to meet her again. She does not show up to their date. Why doesn't she show up, and how does he feel about it? Death stands him up, in other words. What do we make of this?
I sort of feel like she's still, like as she's going through this, she's still kind of struggling with sort of her duty to kill.
Yes?
So I guess in my mind, she doesn't want to kill him, that's why she doesn't show up. She might follow through with it.
In other words, if she were to meet him face to face, then she would have to deliver the letter. She would have to kill him. In other words, she doesn't show up because she wants to let him live. In other words, once again, she's going against her mandate. The mandate of death is to kill. She no longer wants to kill. She does not want to kill the cellist, and maybe she does not want to kill, period. The cellist, however, cannot forget her, right? He cannot get her out of his mind. So let's read the paragraph at the bottom of page 24, where he describes his feelings for death. Can somebody read it to us, starting with, he couldn't forget the woman. So who wants to read that for us?
He couldn't forget the woman. He didn't want to. He could see her standing up, her two hands pressed to her breast. He could feel the touch of her intense gaze, hard as a diamond, and how it shone when she smiled. He would see her again on Saturday, he thought. Yes, he would see her then, but she would not stand up again, nor press her hands to her breast, nor look at him from afar, that magical moment had been swallowed up, undone by the moment that followed. And he turned to see her for the last time, or so he thought, when she was no longer there.
So, how do we understand the cellist's growing longing for death? There is no other way to describe it. He longs for death. He waits for her. He cannot wait to meet her again. What do we make of this? Does that make him, well, a Schopenhauerian nihilist? Ramon.
I don't know. I guess it just feels like I don't know the answer to that because she's transforming and she doesn't like it's not necessarily like death itself that he's being seduced by. It's or like the idea of death. Like he doesn't seem like she's like different and mysterious in a way that he doesn't understand.
Yeah.
But she's not like suicidal, but he's like,
Right.
he
Yeah.
doesn't even know.
Yeah, he obviously does not know that he has fallen in love with death, but he understands that this woman is different, that she is unlike any other woman that he has ever met. And it seems that his longing for her, right, his desire to meet death, at least at first glance, suggests that he is someone who becomes a nihilist, someone who succumbs to decadence, someone who falls in love with death and morbidity. In other words, a kind of a Schopenhauerian nihilist, someone who falls in love with death without perhaps even realizing that what he wants, what he longs for, right, is, well, to escape his own existence.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting that this comes after his solo,
Yeah.
where we
Mhm.
identified that it was almost like a marker of him being ready for death.
Yes.
This is his farewell song, and then from there, their kind of love takes off.
So this idea that the cellist gradually falls in love with death suggests, right, that his relationship to death changes in the course of the novel. That from this point forward, from the moment of the performance, which is of course a turning point, that his relationship to death becomes different. That he no longer fears death, but instead sees death as desirable. We still need to try to settle the question of whether or not this is either morbid or nihilistic. I don't think it is, but let's see what you decide towards the end of the novel. So why don't we read another paragraph on page 233 where the cellist describes falling in love with death. Can somebody read it to us, starting towards the top? The next day was Sunday. So who's going to read that for us? You have read enough. I think I'm going to give you a break. Would anybody else like to read?
What page is it?
233. The next day.
The next day was Sunday, and Sunday is the day he takes the dog for a walk. Love repays love, the animal seemed to be saying, with his lead in his mouth and eager to be off. They entered the park, and the cellist was just heading toward the bench where he usually sat, when he saw a woman was already sitting there. Park benches are free, public, and usually gratis. We can't say to someone who arrives before us, this bench is mine, kindly find another. A well-brought-up man like the cellist would never do that, and certainly not if he thought he recognized that person as the woman from the theater, the woman who had stood him up, the woman he had seen in the middle of the music room with her two hands pressed to her breast. As we know, at 50, we can't always trust our eyes. We start to blink, to screw them up, as if we were trying to imitate the heroes of the Wild West or the navigators of long ago, on top of a horse or at the prow of a caravel, one hand shading their eyes as they scan distant horizons.
Great, let's stop there. And let's turn to page 234, where the conversation between them begins. So who wants to read for us, starting with, why do you want me to tell you? So who's going to read that for us? Do you see it? 234? Julie, you don't see it? Okay, go ahead, Will.
Why do you want me to tell you? Do you really want me to tell you, asked the cellist with a vehemence that bordered on despair. Yes, I do, because I've fallen in love with a woman that I know nothing about, who is amusing herself at my expense, who will go off tomorrow, who knows where, and who I'll never see again. It's actually today that I'll be leaving, not tomorrow. But you said, and it isn't true, that I've been amusing myself at your expense. Well, if you haven't, you certainly did an excellent imitation. As for you falling in love with me, you can hardly expect me to respond. There are certain words my mouth is forbidden to speak. Another mystery. And it won't be the last. Once we've said goodbye, all the mysteries will be resolved. Others might take their place. Please, go away. Don't torment me anymore. The letter. Look, I don't want to know anything about the letter. The fact is I couldn't give it to you even if I wanted to. I left it at the hotel, said the woman, smiling. Then tear it up. Yes, I'll have to think what to do with it. There's no need to think. Tear it up and be done with it. The woman got to her feet. "Are you leaving already?" asked the cellist. He hadn't moved. He was sitting with his head bowed. He still had something to say. "I've never even touched you," he murmured. "No, I was the one who stopped you touching me. How did you manage that? It wasn't that difficult. No, not even now, not even now. We could at least shake hands." "My hands are cold." The cellist looked up. The woman was no longer there.
So Death comes to the park to bid the cellist a final farewell. It is during that meeting that he confesses his love for her and also begs her to tear up the letter. What do we make of all this? First of all, how do you understand the cellist's confession of love to Death? This is where he speaks of it explicitly. He says that he has fallen in love with her, which means that he has fallen in love with his own death. Yet, right, when she speaks to him of a letter that she cannot deliver to him, he begs her to tear it up. Can somebody else help us out? What do you think, Zeus?
It doesn't feel like nihilism to me.
Of course not. Why?
Because he doesn't want to die.
Yes.
Even though he's in love with his own death, per se.
Right.
He wants to be able to be in love with her and exist within a world with her and not just to wither away and be done with it.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that he wants to be done with it is the looming of the death. But he doesn't want, he's not like explicitly, he's not like, just kill me.
Right. Yeah. So this passage seems to contradict the nihilistic interpretation. By falling in love with his own death, the cellist is not ultimately longing for death. He does not express a desire to die. What does he express a desire for instead? Exactly. In other words, by falling in love with death, the cellist expresses not his desire to die, right, but his desire to live.
And he asks her to tear up the letter, which symbolically is saying that his death cannot be delivered.
Exactly. So one of the things that we've been talking about is that the confrontation with our own mortality might make us fall in love with life. And this is precisely what seems to happen to the cellist. By falling in love with death, he seems to discover his desire for life. In confessing his love to death, what he seems to express is not the desire to escape his existence, the way that Schopenhauer had envisioned, right? The nihilistic interpretation of this passage. But instead, by falling in love with death, he expresses a desire for life. In other words, love for Kierkegaard was a force that takes us beyond ourselves and ultimately makes it possible for us to, well, sacrifice ourselves, right, for the sake of, well, a greater sort of whole. In this case, what we see is the opposite of the Kierkegaardian interpretation of love. Love in this case is not associated with the desire for death. Instead, it becomes associated with the desire for life. So these are some subtle parallels, but also some important differences between the first work and, well, one of the later works that we're discussing. I hope that you're seeing those connections.
I just couldn't, when I was reading it, I just couldn't get over the fact that, like, their relationship was so, like, strange.
Yeah.
Like, she was so weird, and he was, like, off. He was, like, really, he was kind of off-put by her for a while. Like, the courting process was so awkward, it felt
like all courting processes.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Sure, but it would just, it's so interesting that, like, what he's depicting and what he's illustrating is love, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's this love story, and yet, like, it isn't, it's not like, oh, and then it becomes, like, this romance novel or something. It's not like they then embody, like, this perfect love. It's this, it feels like a very human love with, like, awkwardness and, strange phone calls and trying to figure out the other one's intention and, like, you're not giving me anything, but I'm into it somehow.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree with you. It turns out dating death is no different from dating anyone, according to Saramago. It it is subject to some of the same awkwardness, mystery, and, well, pain and suffering that apparently old dating entails. So in that sense, it is very human. These two characters are falling in love with each other, and in spite of the fact that one of them is deaf, their love for each other seems to resemble human love. So, point well taken. And one of the things that we know is that their love affair ends with a sexual encounter, which of course is, well, I think from the standpoint of the novel itself, somewhat unexpected. Were you surprised? So why don't we read some of those passages and try to understand what happens when their love is consummated, when they engage in the act of physical love. Let's turn to page 237. And I'd like for someone to read it to us, starting with when he finished playing. So who wants to read that for us? Bottom of page 237. Julie, how about you?
When he finished playing, is that when he?
Yep.
Okay. When he finished playing, her hands were no longer cold and his were on fire, which is why their hands were not in the least surprised when hand reached out to him. It was long after 1 o'clock in the morning when the cellist asked, "Would you like me to call you a taxi back to the hotel?" And the woman replied, "No, I'll stay here with you." And she offered him her mouth. They went into the bathroom and got on.
Bedroom.
Oh, sorry.
Let's just make sure that we're in the right room.